I'm not sure how we follow that last session, to be quite honest, but I guess we'll try. So thanks to everyone who's been involved in this conference. I must say I've learned a lot. So thanks both to the presenters and also to all of you and all of us who have asked questions, which I think often spur some of the most important and most interesting parts of any conference. So maybe the question I could begin with now in this session would be, what is a critical urban political geographer from the global north who works in the global north, works in mostly Europe and Canada and America for the most part. What is someone like him, someone like me? I tried to depersonalize that for a second, but I couldn't. So how does someone like me, or what can someone like me take away from this conference? Well, probably more than I can say, and certainly more than I'll probably know for a while, because these things often take quite a bit of time to percolate. What I'm going to try and list here are three modalities of the city debates over the last couple of days that I think particularly stick out in my mind. There are many more modalities running through this debate, I'm sure, but these are the three that I'm going to pull out. So the three of them, the first one is intellectual labour and praxis. So praxis as in the sense of knowledge and practice coming together. The second one is concepts and ideas that are being mobilized, and I mean mobilized in that sense both in a literal and a figurative sense, but in the sense of being articulated through this debate as well as being moved around. And the third one being the objects and institutions to which that conceptualization and that praxis is directed and relationally connected. So I want to try and touch on each of those and to think what I've learned, what I've noticed through the debate over the last couple of days in those contexts, and to try to do it in a way, and I'm not always going to be successful in every point, but try to do it in a way where I'm talking both about how academics are intellectualizing these themes that I'm going to touch on, but at the same time how practitioners are engaging with the themes. I've tried to pick themes that at least for me, seem to be ones that are being engaged with in one way or another, both by academics and by the practitioners. So the first one is intellectual labour, and intellectual work, if you like, and praxis. And what I mean in general terms in that context then is conceptualization, contextualization, which we've seen through a lot of the discussions, and problematization. These types of intellectual work seem to have run through a lot of the discussions, even up until just a few minutes ago, I think. More specifically, there's a few types of intellectual labour that I think are maybe worth talking about briefly. The first one is innovation. Is conceptualizing, contextualizing, problematizing the notion of innovation. What has been done new? What needs to be done new? What theories need to be invented or reinvented in order to try to understand this new situation, this emergent situation? And innovation, following on the economist Joseph Schumpeter from the first half of the 20th century, he defined innovation as the bringing together of new combinations of things and ideas that already existed. So innovation then, I think, and new combinatory labour, if you like, are things that you see coming through in these discussions. There's an emergent situation a crisis, if you will, that needs to be addressed. And the way that it's being addressed, both conceptually and practically, I think, in many ways, is by drawing on existing practice and existing thoughts, but also combining things in different ways to address the specific situation. Those new combinations, then, I think, often generate new forms of decision making and new forms of analysis. They also are involved in the mobilizing of models and concepts. As new parts of a new strategy or a new concept or a new theorization come together, there's that mobilization of models and concepts. As part of that, then, there needs to be efforts to reconcile and make commensurable things and places and people that might in many ways seem at first to be incommensurable. So that can be new populations living in the same neighbourhoods as old ones. It can be concepts that need to be re-articulated in new ways, even though they might seem to not work together at first, maybe in the slightly more traditional ways in which we've thought about them in the past. And it's about places. It's about thinking about how lessons from crises in the past or crises elsewhere might influence practice and theorization in the particular context that we are in. So that's a geographical work that all of this is engaged in one way or another. Other types of intellectual work along those lines then are comparison, measurement, metric making, data generation, which isn't always around from what I can gather from these discussions. And then another one is experimentation. Experimentation is increasingly, at least in the urban studies or urban geography literature, is increasingly being identified as central to contemporary governance. And that's an argument that's being made by academics who are studying, for example, climate change. Harriet Buckley at Durham has made this argument, or studying anti-poverty strategies. Jamie Peck and Nick Theodore in their recent book also talk about the almost chronic experimentality or more systemic experimentality, they call it, as being almost definitive of contemporary governance. So I see a lot of discussion of experiments that are not all going to work in these discussions over the last few days, and that's a particular type of intellectual labour that everybody's involved in. That intellectual labour then also means thinking through specificity, thinking through situatedness, locality, and through that, those types of engagements are about the production of scale and the reproduction of new types of scales, and through that the reproduction of territories and new types of territories. So for example, yesterday there was a lot of discussion about regionalisation in the sense of powers being devolved from the national level and responsibilities being taken away from very underfunded, under-resourced local municipalities to a new kind of regional scale with these unions of municipalities coming together in Lebanon. And that's the production of a new geographical scale that's not just conceptual, it's not just theoretical, but it's very much practical and has material implications. So that's praxis. The second one is the three, at least in my head, are related. So the second one then is the concepts and the ideas that are being mobilized through this discussion, and this discussion then referencing concepts and ideas that are being mobilized in the field on the ground. The city / the urban, and those are often not seen as being exactly the same thing in urban academic literatures. That's something that's been thought and rethought through some of these discussions. What do we mean by the city? What do we mean by the urban in the context of the present situation? But also similar geographical terms, the subnational region, the national, the wider geopolitical region, are all things that have factored in our discussions, and I deliberately leave the wider geopolitical region undefined in a sense, because it's being defined and redefined by the flows of migrants and by flows or lack of flows of attention and money and so on coming back and forth. So you may in the end go global with that region. Other concepts and ideas that have been mobilized through this debate, and I think are quite important, is the question, first of all, the question of crisis, and the related term emergency, right? And obviously that's been running through a lot, and those two terms don't necessarily always mean the same thing or don't have the same register. Mobility has come through quite a lot and is obviously in the title of the conference, and that's both mobility in the sense of people moving around, but also in the sense of ideas moving around, which is often a people process in itself. People carry the ideas with them as they move around. They carry the policy models and so on, but then those ideas and strategies also move around through the internet as well. Another concept that has come up, especially I think today, actually the next three of these I think have been especially today and have been very valuable to me as somebody who's ignorant about these topics. The first one is life, as I think quite a central concept, and we can parse that out in many ways. So planners, especially planners in affluent countries, like to obsess themselves or be obsessed by quality of life. But we're also talking about basically good life, and good life for whom and not for whom else. That's a term. And also a concept that I'm not particularly convinced by, but I'll throw it out because it does have a connotation that's useful here, and that would be bare life, the basics of life. These seem to be central to what we're talking about, and obviously make these conversations so important. Similarly, another term that hasn't really come up explicitly but is in the background is refuge. We've talked a lot about refugees, obviously, but refuge it seems to me to be the thing we're interested in giving people refuge and allowing people to create a refuge. And of course, we're talking about this in the context of a conference about city debates. And cities, in many ways, through their history, have been refuges, right? For some and not for others. Walled cities, cities on islands, etc. There's maybe a relationship historically that could be explored about the fundamental nature of the city as a refuge, and therefore maybe an articulation of why cities should remain refuges, maybe as opposed to or in combination with camps. Another one is futures, future and futures. Planning by definition is future-oriented, but as we heard in the session just before, sometimes that might mean on the other side that we have amnesia about the past. And therefore we need to think carefully and critically about our notions of time as well as our notions of space. And then, of course, the other one is policy. Policy making, policy makers. Or are we just talking, as someone said in the last session, and I can't remember who it was, somebody from the floor, said about, are we really just talking about projects or strategies or just making do even, perhaps? The third modality, and the last one, just to assure you, is the objects and institutions involved. And primarily here, of course, is the refugees themselves. Also the donors, the agencies, the international governmental organizations, and so on. We could also in this category include civil society, social movements, and so on have all been discussed. But the other big one that's been discussed, and again came up in the last session, is the state. And maybe there's questions about whether we need to re-theorize or create new theories of the state. Does our theory of the state in this particular context of Lebanon or this crisis, does that theory of the state, can a theory of the state in this context draw on theories of the state that have come from the global north, have come from 100 years ago or 50 years ago? These are questions that are extant in the urban studies literature right now about cities in general, as well as theories of the state, perhaps. The state is peopled. It's not. We shouldn't reify it, I suppose. And of course, planning and governance are part of the state, and those similarly should be seen as being peopled and shouldn't be reified. They are, of course, also the state and governance are very much fragmented. And coordination is something that seems to be still a goal rather than something that's been achieved. And it strikes me, especially again from the last discussion, that this university and other universities in Lebanon would seem to be well positioned, and this conference is exactly that sort of thing. Well positioned to make those networks and to generate information that might make coordination better. And then, of course, there's the issue of the competencies and capacities of the state, or the lack thereof. And some of us were saying at the break there that the term that was used in the last session as the national state as a hologram really was an excellent term and really summed up a lot of maybe what was going on. So praxis, concepts, objects and institutions. And then people, cities, and politics. That's crucial to what geographers think about those things, people, cities, and politics particularly. It's crucial what geographers think about. It's crucial and central to what planners think about. And I think this conference has shown, at least me, that it seems to be increasingly central to what people working in international aid are interested in. Thanks.